Okay, thanks very much. I think the organisers have done a great job in bringing so many interesting people into the room, but also in putting in particular this session together, because I think actually they gel quite nicely, the three papers. Hopefully we'll have a good discussion. So Karen has reminded me to stick to the time limit as closely as possible. So I'll really try to give this a very quick run through, which is quite complicated, because we've done a lot of empirical work on this project for the last 2 years, and this is really the first time we're trying to step back from, so what does it all mean? There are all these different cases, different countries, so what does it add up to? So this is really our first attempt at it, so it's very preliminary, and I welcome all the feedback that you have. Okay, so I skipped the first one already, because it is about energy transition and the need for them, and I think we've discussed it at length. The problems around energy security have been mentioned, problems about renewable energy and climate change and affordability issues. And just to say that sort of the starting point of this paper is really the sort of transition literature that argues that a structural change in socio-technical systems in the energy area is necessary to address all of these problems together. Where are we coming from with this is this notion of niche that Marcus has explained already, so I'll not dwell too much on it, but the idea is that sort of this bottom-up change starts in niche, and that these niches need to be nurtured in some way, that there are these technologies out there, renewable energy technologies, for example, that are not competitive under current market conditions or in the way policy frameworks are set up, either not profitable for people to invest in, or they're not enticing people to get involved with the energy system, and think more about community-led initiatives and so on and so forth. So basically, these alternatives don't really fit well with existing structures and are not competitive. Okay? And so the idea is, if we have these niches, that they can be nurtured over time, and that they can improve their performance, can decrease the price, become more socially embedded, and this is a process that can be stimulated over time through this protective space. So when we talk about space, we're not talking about it in a kind of a geographical sense. For us, protective space is an institutional space. So it's a space, for example, where rules are different, can be also specialized market niche. So, for example, PV cells have been used for a very long time in specialized market applications in space, for example, or remote telecoms installations. So there are spaces where these technologies are already competitive, or we think about the alternative technologies movement, people wanting to unconnect from the grid in the 70s and 80s, so that was, if you want, a sort of cultural space where people were experimenting with these technologies, and we're not concerned about price performance necessarily, but we're interested in other political things like being independent from the regime incumbents, for example. Okay, so the idea is that these spaces, some of them exist already, and some are created for policy instruments. We talk about feed-in tariffs and other policy instruments, but of course trying to create more space, more learning for these niches to develop over time and improve and get embedded in existing energy systems. Okay, a lot of the literature is around the impact of these spaces. So if you refer to the strategic niche management literature or the technological innovation systems literature, they somehow assume, so policy instruments are there are feed-in tariffs, and then look at what that does to the technology. You know, how have prices come down? How many people have adopted these? How many people have installed them in their homes, and so on and so forth. So it's the impact of these spaces on the development of the technology. Okay, and what we argue that actually the politics of creating that protective space in the first place. You know, how do these institutions come into being? How do these policy instruments come into being? But that's understudied, and that's really the claim, the starting point for our analysis. This is, as I said, a 3-year project. We're now sort of in the latest phase of the project. We've been working on this for 2 years. This is work that's been led by Adrian Smith at SPRU and Rob Brown at the Technical University of Eindhoven, and also involves Brava Heers. And the aim is really to analyze these dynamics of protective space in sustainability transition. So we've been doing 4 cases, as I said. So we've been studying PV and offshore wind in both of these countries, which is what I will be talking about today. And we're about to do, or we're currently doing, also work on carbon capture and storage in both of these countries. Conceptually, we come at this from an angle that will be very familiar to, because it's very topical today in terms of agency in politics being central to the governance of transition. I think this is a shared convention around the room, so I won't dwell on this too much. And we've already discussed a little bit around the sustainable energy transitions are not a single, there's different options, there are all these different niche technologies with different actors and interests associated with them that are competing for this protective space. So that advocates of small scale all the way to CCS, that's what was one of the criteria for the selection of these case studies, that we've kind of a variety of different options in there, and these options are often contested. Frank talked about nuclear being contested and so on and so forth, and compete for public and private resources, investment. And the analytical focus is really around the three contexts of actors. So as the carriers of agency, so obviously we're interested in the politics of agency is very important. It's not just system dynamics, it's the actors that make things work. As networks, in the transition literature, obviously it's very clear that no actor can unilaterally somehow achieve a transition, so it is about actor networking with other actors, trying to form coalitions. And then there's narratives they draw on as a very important tool of how to convince other actors that this is something worth doing, or attract new entrants into these areas, or attract resources, and trying to frame their technology or their innovation as a solution to some of the problems that they're pointing out in the regime. And often we were talking about, this was an interesting discussion sort of just now between Mark and Frank around, well, sort of early stage fostering of these innovations and enabling learning and improvements, but then at the later stages, sort of the fighting against the regime, the dynamics within the socio-technical systems and how to link up with that, how to sort of diffuse widespread deployment of these niche innovations will often involve institutional rule changes at the regime level. And that's something we see start happening in the UK if you think about electricity market reform that was already talked about earlier. So the question for this paper, at least, is really, so why are some of these sustainable energy advocates more successful than others in creating this kind of protective space I was describing for their respective niche? So this is overall the framework. So as I said, sort of studying the actors, networks, and narratives, trying to create these protective spaces. And then also we see there is a recursive relationship, and I'm not going to talk very much about the second bit, but it is a bit more in the paper, or at least in the single case study papers, where then these processes of this protective space have an impact on the socio-technical configuring that goes on in the field. But I'll talk mainly about the first bit on creating that protective space in the first place, and why in some places that happens more than others. Okay, literally I have one slide to summarize those 4 different cases. So that's quite a challenge, but as I said, this was the first opportunity for us to step back and think about this a bit more conceptually and what it means for future research as well. Okay, so if you compare what's been happening in PV in the UK and the Netherlands with other countries, then actually it's quite a disappointing story in the sense that deployment, there has been some deployment, there have been policy instruments to support PV in terms of innovation, but also a little bit in terms of rollout, with, for example, the feed-in tariff in the UK recently, but then also cutbacks, policy changes in the feed-in tariff in the UK, but also in the subsidy schemes in the Netherlands. So still very contested and not a lot of rollout, if you want, so not a lot of this kind of diffusion widely. The reason for that, we argue, is that basically the advocates in this area really failed to create a sustained and effective protective space. And in both of these countries, PV as an option to be part of the energy transition is still contested. It's to do with high costs. Also, the narrative often is, well, we're in northern European countries, there's not enough sun, so this is not a good option. Maybe that works in Africa for solar pumps, but it's really not something for centralized electricity generation. Grid-based systems like in the UK and in the Netherlands. But then also tensions within, if you want, the PV advocacy groupings around what is PV for. So we see, historically, for example, there has been a lot of emphasis on PV for remote locations, on islands maybe in the Netherlands, or even being abroad, for developing countries as a suitable technology for these countries, but not in centralized settings. As well as sort of the size of the installation. So is PV about retrofitting it on roofs, like subsidized by the feed-in tariff, or is it about building integrated? I had a picture of the CIS tower in Manchester, it's about building integrated, so PV is then a building material, or is it about solar farms? A lot of the contestation in the feed-in tariff case in the UK was around fat cats and solar farms, big investors, and that being undesired for some of the other PV advocates. So even within the, sort of the PV camp, if you want, there's lots of contestations, which then the argument is that that makes it more difficult for them to get purchased by policymakers and other actors and investors. And that's despite the fact that PV over time has tried to reframe the technology as a response to all sorts of policy problems, initially of course during the energy crisis in the 1970s, and now a lot more to do with job creation as well as climate change. Offshore wind in the UK and the Netherlands is quite an interesting case because there were some early experiments, and the second offshore wind farm in the world was installed in the Netherlands, not very far offshore, but there was sort of an attempted early lead and R&D investment in this area. But then in the last couple of years, momentum was really lost as policy support has been shifting around, subsidy schemes have been cut, new subsidies have been brought in, then abandoned again, lots of different new coalition governments coming in, not finishing their term of office, lots of challenges around that, as well as more generally to the importance of climate change. And whether that's an important energy policy goal. Energy security issues were solved out in a different way by just building new coal-fired power stations. So there's less of a problem in terms of energy security in the Netherlands compared to the UK, which plays into some of these explanations around why offshore wind was then so much more successful in the UK. So as I said, the UK was a sort of late starter in offshore wind, not doing anything. It was Denmark and the Netherlands that were initially driving this forward, but has now really become a leader in terms of deployment of this technology. So there's more than 2.5 gigawatts. So that replaced, if you want, 2 medium-sized coal-fired power stations or 1.5 nuclear power stations. So it's really quite big scale rollout that has happened recently, despite really high costs. I said in PV, the argument was always, oh, this is far too expensive. Offshore wind costs actually have been going up rather than down. Nevertheless, we see quite strong policy commitment to roll out as a way of decreasing costs as well as intensified investment in energy R&D, what Martin showed earlier on his graphs. A lot of that is going to offshore wind. So by the dual strategy of both roll out as well as funding for innovation. Okay, this is a very quick run through a couple of things we've been learning about. But as I said, it's sort of the first attempt, so this is really preliminary, and I would value your feedback on this. And we still have to do the other 2 cases, so these things will change. But one of the interesting findings is actually that the kind of narratives people use to achieve that kind of protective space for the different technologies are quite similar. So a lot of these technologies have received a lot of interest since the 1970s already. Offshore wind, even then, for example, was hailed as one solution to the energy problem, and the narratives used addressing energy security initially, or the oil crisis in the 1970s, and then of course in the more recent phase, it's more around addressing climate change, contributing to mitigation targets, contributing to meeting the renewable energy targets set by the European Union, and so on and so forth, as well as creating jobs, attracting investment into the UK or the Netherlands. All of these narratives are actually used in all 4 case studies. So in that sense, the conclusion for that could be that actually their explanatory power, in our cases at least, is very limited. Okay, so this wider reframing we talked about, sort of if you think about it in the macro terms, I think it is more about centralized electricity generation and options like PV. So if you look at it at that level, then there is some influence, but if you look purely at the technological level, then not necessarily that important for them. One of the things we found is not surprising, but it's worth emphasizing in terms of the normal interest-based politics that Frank was talking about. But of course, these are spaces where powerful industry, incumbent regime actors have waded into. If you think about, BP, for example, established a BP Solar in the UK and have then put quite a bit of money into R&D initially and then decided it was not for them and withdrew from that. But in terms of creating protective space and getting buy-in from other actors, these are actually quite important developments because it restores credibility in policymakers' eyes often for these niches. And that same is true, that's one of the explanations for offshore wind. It's very close to existing regime players. Everyone who's investing in this, it's Shell, it's Dawn, it's E.ON, it's the big utilities or the energy companies that have credibility and that seem to make this something worthwhile for policymakers to support. Then it's also about, we talk about the active networks and the coordination and or the lack of contestation. And in terms of the offshore wind, the social technical configuration in which people want to embed offshore wind in the electricity system is pretty clear. It's large scale, big farms with single grid connections, or maybe connected across the North Sea even. And all the investors in this space agree on that, so it's uncontested, which is very different to the story I was telling you briefly about PV, with different actors pushing for quite different socio-technical configurations in which they wanted this technology to use. So in terms of innovation, you could say a variety of different niche markets is a strength, but I think in terms of the political power, in terms of these processes of great political, it's then easier, for example, when it comes to cutting feed-in tariffs, it's then easier if there is contestation between actors. It's easier for the government to say, well, we'll limit the size of installations for which the subsidy can be applied, or we'll focus it at more small scale. We didn't want these solar farms at a point when this then becomes quite expensive for government. Okay. And the last point is really the obvious point to make, that if you go back, offshore wind, I think, was even considered in the 1920s in the Netherlands as one possibility of producing energy. But then, at least since the 1970s, there was quite sort of a big effort, not always consistently, has been coming and going over time, but at least since the 1970s, people have been trying to push for these, the solar societies were set up in the UK and in the Netherlands in the 1970s, and these actors, trade bodies established, and so they've been trying to establish their technology as part of the solution to whatever energy policy problem is dominant at the time. And it just sort of illustrates that these processes of creating protective space are fraught with difficulties and really involve long-term political and economic struggles between these different options and with what is dominant in the existing electricity systems. So I think I'll leave it there for the sake of having enough time for discussion. So thank you very much.